good evening. Thank you for your presence here. I think that many people have been the last 2 days before. For those that the new time here, the first time, thank you for being with us. And we are here part of 1 week, some kind of symposium that we do together with the Batikol Institute and Ratisbon Institute together. And for this week we have all the days work, and we choose tonight to make this kind of open conference by this different subject. So just announce that we will be in touch with you for the next future, for the different activities that normally we intend to put on now in this house. Not only in this place, but this house around, the library and everything. So some kind of activities that we not stop it, but we diminish some rhythm, and now we intend to restart again. So thank you for your presence here, and we'll be in touch with you, and I give it to Dr. Marcy to present our speaker today.
Welcome, everyone. I'm very pleased to present to you our speaker for this evening, Dr. Jackie Feldman from Ben Gurion University in Beersheba. I met Jackie about 15 years ago, somewhere around there, when I was a graduate student, and I brought a group of doctoral students and professors from Harvard Divinity School to see a lot of things here, and each day we had a different guide, and our guides were usually the archaeologists who did the dig in that place, because when you're from Harvard, they do things like that. But one day, and they were impressive, okay, but I have to say that the day that we went to the Mount of Olives, Jackie was our guide that day, and he talked to us about pilgrimage, everybody was blown away, okay, deeply affected by what we learned from Jackie that day. And since then, actually, Jackie doesn't know, but I've been sort of, as they say now, lurking, right? Following him not on the internet, but I've been reading what he's written, and most recently, actually, his book, A Jewish Guide in the Holy Land, How Christian Pilgrims Made Me Israeli, is an excellent book. Unfortunately, he did not bring a pile of them to sell. Very bad marketing. But still, if you can get a copy of the book, well, you'll see tonight that we all have a lot to learn from Dr. Feldman, from Jackie. So tonight he'll be speaking about ancient Jewish pilgrimage and modern Christian pilgrimage, I think. Right? That sort of. It was a very, very long title, but I think I got most of the words. Anyway, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Okay. I must say, first of all, thank you all for coming this evening, and I must say that this is, I feel very indebted to the Ratisbon, and particularly to Dr. Elio Paceto, because it's in part thanks to the Ratisbon that I, for one, could finish my doctorate. Because 20 years ago, when I had the books and things that I needed far more space than I had in the house, and there was no place at the Hebrew University. Elio volunteered the seat in the library in the closet, and I spent 2 years working in the Ratisbon library, finishing my doctorate at the time. So I'm grateful and indebted. I'm going to talk this evening. How much time should I? Okay, fine. I'm going to talk really about, I think about, well, 2 different topics that I'll try to relate, because one, biographically for me they're related, and second, because I found that many of the questions that Christian pilgrims brought with them were the questions that I posed to the historical materials of Second Temple pilgrimage. And then, having done and understood Second Temple pilgrimage, these helped me to understand first what I was doing for a living, which was for 20 years guiding Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, right? As a Jewish guide to Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, and then later other materials as well. And the models of pilgrimage and the movement of pilgrimage is really what has accompanied me through the, I would say, three areas that I've studied over the last, 30 years or so. The first being pilgrimage to the experience of pilgrims to the Second Temple. The second being the voyages of Israeli youth groups to Holocaust sites in Poland, which I won't talk about this evening, but perhaps another time. And the third, a retrospective look at what the hell was I doing, in guiding Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, and what are not only the tensions, but the cross-fertilizations of being a Jewish guide for Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, and I'll try to connect them up. Okay. When I first came here to Israel, I was born and grew up in New York City and moved here in 1978, so it's 40 years now, not in the desert, but here, right? I had I'd come here and from an Orthodox, modern Orthodox yeshiva education, and after about a year here, I saw that I was not going to be able to make a living very quickly as a scholar in Jewish studies, so I better find some other way. And I started to guide, and I went into the tour guide course here. And I found that there was a move that there, when we were taken from place to place in the what's known as Yidiat Haaretz, or knowledge of the land tours, and one of the things that's often done was to go to a particular hill and to reference that place in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, and then to explain where the place was, and if possible, why, how the geography of the place might illustrate in new ways the biblical text. So I remember very clearly with the time Sefi ben Yosef, we're going and standing on top of a hill, and he points out, you see where the trees are here, the trees are there, the olive trees are at the top of the hill, and if you go below that line, right there you won't see any trees anymore, but you'll see there are crops that are planted there, and if you look down in the wadi, in the riverbed below, you'll see that what's there growing, I don't know. I grew up in New York City. I wouldn't know one plant from another. But if you look there, there's wheat and barley. And then he asks, well, why do you think there are olives on the top of the hill and not in the middle? I didn't have a clue. The only olives I knew came out of bottles where I grew up, right, or cans. And he opened up then at the time, if I'm not mistaken, Deuteronomy 9, right, I could be off, but saying, the land which you are coming in to inherit is not like the land of Egypt from whence you came, where you sowed your seed and you watered it with your foot like a vegetable garden. It is a land of hills and valleys. From the rain of the heavens you shall drink water, a land which the eyes of the Lord your God are upon the entirety, from the beginning of the year until the end. Take heed that you not go and serve foreign gods, and it continues. And he then took us down to the next hill and over to the retaining basin, which was by the spring. There's some still that you can see, one not far from me in Batir, if you get there. And he said, look, how do you water the land with your foot? I don't know. You go and you take up buckets. And he said, well, watch, and there was it's still at the time, I still think today in Batir, a man with a measuring stick, and there would be and various ditches of dirt that came out of the collecting basin that collected the water from the karstic spring. And then he would measure, and then he would go and kick off the the mud, and then all the water would now flow into, let's say, Ahmed's field. And then he'd come back, he'd stand there, he'd come back in an hour, and he'd see it went down to another notch, and then he'd kick that closed, and then walk over to another trench, and then kick that open, and now the water goes into Mahmoud's field, or whoever, right? That's how you irrigate the land with your foot, like a vegetable garden, or like in Egypt, where all of the land is irrigated from the Nile. And he said, that's what it is, so that's the vegetable garden, but the rest is a land of hills and valleys. So you can't count on the water flowing from the central river or spring. You need to pray, right, either to God or for the people of the land to the Baals in order to bring down the rain in its proper time. And so where the water is, the field, where the area is below the spring, it gets more water and you plant your crops. And where it's above the spring, then this is called in Hebrew Chakla'ut Baal, or Baal agriculture, meaning that it receives its water only from heaven. And therefore you can't plant your squash, tomatoes, whatever, above the spring, because water flows down, not up. That's how you do it. Now, I knew that verse by heart. It was something that we had to learn, in school. But I had no idea what it was to water with your foot. And now it made sense, and that's why there are olive trees there and not here. Okay? Now, why do I mention this? Because this is a kind of knowledge that I found when I began to guide that was the same kind of, in some ways, relation that Christian groups, in particular, I would say evangelicals, but not strictly, desire to know where they come, and that makes, quote, the Bible come to life for them, because it makes it rooted in the land. It's a kind of knowledge that comes from the text to the land, rather than simply being, well, this is where I've always lived, right? It's for me, coming to Israel, the land and the olive trees was something that I had never seen growing up, right? But the text was something that I did have growing up and knew well, and then came here, and all of a sudden, part of my connection as an immigrant, as someone who grew up in an Orthodox background to the land, in many ways was the same as what at least the evangelicals were looking for and saying, look, here the Bible, you see there? Okay. And they'll take that then home with them and say, in their next Bible study, or in their saying, well, hey, I learned something, why that's why olive trees are planted up there and not down here, and so on. So that you have this curiosity that many, not all, but many Jewish Israeli guides who come out of the guide school walk onto a bus in some ways, of Christian pilgrims, and the ways that they think are natural about explaining the land seem to be, for many, natural to them, and they think that that's the way it is. Well, it's not the way it is. It's a result of a particular training, a particular relation between scripture and land that's not necessarily that of the native. The farmer, the person with the watering stick, or Ahmed who has the field, doesn't need to read Deuteronomy 9 to know. He knows, because that's what my father did. These are the rights I got from my grandfather, and if I don't do it that way, then the tomatoes won't grow, right? But my relation in coming from book to land, and it's one that Zionism practiced and that has gone over through guiding practice, is very much, historically also, I would say, a Christian or a Protestant way of relating to land, and therefore historically these overlap, and that way one can reach a conversation that's meaningful, so much so that one thinks that it's natural, it's the way you do things. Well, it's not. There's nothing natural about it, just as there's nothing natural about understanding the land by going to an outlook point. But for Zionists and for Protestants, it's very natural. For Greek Orthodox, it's not at all natural, and you don't need to go to the top of the hill to understand what the site is about. You go off the bus and quickly into the Holy Sepulchre and bow down, not get up to the top of the Mount of Olives and look down, okay? So this simply to say, all this by way of too long introduction, but to say that these are ways that I found that growing up that became part of my connection to the land, and one of the ways that was affirmed through performing that connection very often for groups of Christian pilgrims, not all. Christian pilgrims, for my case, mostly Protestant, sometimes Catholic, different languages, but mostly from the West. Okay. So when I began to guide, okay, and I was working with Christian pilgrims, first England, then from Holland, from Germany, and so on, I would ask them, so, you know, what brought you here? And they would give me a number of different answers, right? I'd read the Bible and I'd always wanted to come to the place where Jesus walked. Or some, why did you want to come here? He says, I didn't want to come here, I wanted to go to Hawaii, but God told me to come here. Okay. There were a number of, various answers, but these resulted in my asking, okay, when at the time I was studying Second Temple period sources, and I asked, so what brought people here then? And I figured that somewhere people are humans and don't change all that much, and I may get different answers, but these are the questions that one should ask. What is it that brought you here? What makes this place meaningful for you? What are you going to take back with you when you go back? What is the experience of the group that goes with you? What kind of groups do you go? And then to make sense of rather curious things, like a group landing at Ben Gurion Airport and then coming on the bus and saying, oh, it's the first time, but I feel so much at home here. And I say, does your home look like an airport or a tour bus? Right? But somehow one has to make sense of that, and then to ask these, I started saying, let me ask these questions to the sources that we have from the Second Temple period, or that describe pilgrimage to the Second Temple. And that's how I started out. And at the time, the book, by now there are a few others, but the book, certainly in Hebrew, about Second Temple pilgrimage, was written by the now deceased Shmuel Safrai, called Pilgrimage to the Second Temple. And it's a book that had an average of about 100 sources and references per page, right? And he begins the book, and I said, oh great, this is what I want to know. And it begins the book with a whole chapter on the obligation of pilgrimage. Who is obliged and who is not obliged, and if you're a boy, if you can walk it. And I said, oh, my rabbis have come back to haunt me, right? This is what people are interested in? They're wondering, am I obliged or not obliged? On what condition if someone... I couldn't imagine, perhaps from my own point, that everyone going to the Second Temple was walking around with a little, what's called Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, an abridged book of laws in their back pocket, and what really concerned them on coming to Jerusalem was, am I obliged or am I not obliged, So the questions that I asked were those of my pilgrims. Why did you come here? Who did you travel with? What makes this meaningful for you? What was your relation with the other pilgrims who you found in the play, who lived there? And then I came back to the sources to see what I could find, if I could find answers to those questions. I didn't unearth any new sources. The people who are doing archaeology and the Talmudic scholars, I can't come up in that to their ankles. But I did ask different questions that often made me pick out and look at different sources different way. Have a look here. I brought you some texts that on these sheets. And the biblical if you like, urtext for pilgrimage that really speaks not metaphorically of pilgrimage like Abraham, but actually commandments of pilgrimage, is this one, Deuteronomy 16. It's repeated again elsewhere in the Bible. And it says, 3 times yearly shall all your male issues, all your males, be seen before the face of the Lord God at the place he shall choose. Okay? The place he shall choose became, at least from Josiah on, Jerusalem, certainly in Second Temple period sources, right? And to be seen before the face of the Lord God, again, there's very interesting a play on words, to be seen before the face of God and to see the face of God, depending on how you vocalize that particular verb. And the place he shall choose. So this is the command to go up 3 times a year to Jerusalem to offer sacrifice, to bring gifts on the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, and Shavuot, the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, so far so good. This is what you can say that Second Temple pilgrims, certainly by the end of the Second Temple, know, have heard of, assume that this is part of sacred scripture. Okay? If we look at what people actually did on pilgrimage, the Second Temple, right, we have historians, and they have a bit of a problem, because there's always the question with history, who writes the history, what kinds of things are worth being written down, and what kinds of things are important enough to be preserved and copied over, and by whom. I'll give an example that sounds a bit far-fetched, but I think it links up. I was about 35 years ago, traveled the world with a group called Youth Seminar for World Religions. And each evening I had helped to organize, we had someone in the group that came from 70 different countries, right, to give a talk that has to do with their particular religion. And one time it was the turn of a charismatic Pentecostal young woman, and she started out by saying how her father beat her when she was small, and her father had abused alcohol, and then she had left school at age 14, and then started drugs at age 15, and then at age 20, I don't remember exactly, had found Jesus, and he'd changed her life, and now she had given her heart to the Lord. And sitting next to me was a Hindu Indian, Sri Ram, and he turned and he said, the problem with the Americans is that they have no unifying tradition. I said, Sri Ram, if they had a unifying tradition, they probably wouldn't have all come to the United States. They were trying to get away from their unifying tradition. And what's important is new and improved, right? That's what sells, right? Not, it's always been that way. He says, yes, but America's a very young country, only 200 years. I said, Sri Ram, you're so Indian. Only 200 years, right? Why am I telling you this story now? Because the idea that what this story of personal experience, right, a kind of testimony, how I discovered Jesus, how Jesus, right, changed my life, right, is one which in the Hindu tradition, or within many other traditions, probably most of the biblical traditions, don't get written down. We have to wait for Augustine to get confessions, because we don't get many confessions, right, in sacred literature that actually get copied over and preserved, right? So if my question was, what did pilgrims feel like and what did pilgrims do, then we've got to collect them from little crumbs here and there in order to try to put them together, because we have no account of the pilgrim to the Second Temple, or almost none. Here's one. Okay, the second source here. This is from Philo of Alexandria, who came to Jerusalem at least once. Okay, maybe some say more, but at least once. The pilgrim leaves his homeland and his family and friends to sojourn in a strange country. Yet uncounted multitudes arrive, some by sea and some by land, from east and west and north and south on each holiday. The temple serves them as a safe haven from the chaos and confusion of life. There they seek repose. Ties of friendship are created between those who did not know each other before. And the sacrifices and libations are occasions of emotional exchange which provide the strongest certainty that all are of one mind. Okay? So people are coming, what he's describing, first of all, is that Jerusalem acts as a kind of magnet, as it did in the first century, bringing pilgrims at least from Yemen and Persia on one side and Rome and North Africa on the other, right, into Jerusalem for the pilgrimage festivals, sometimes in mass, right? There are places that were, towns that were emptied out, okay? So why did people come? Okay, people are coming in mass just as, right, and that experience of being together, right, of feeling that we are all in one mind is the idea that we are all equal when we stand before God, and the differences between us, differences of class, differences of language, differences of ethnicity, somehow don't seem to matter when they all come, say, to bring the Passover sacrifice together in the temple. And while the idea of being together all at once may not have been the motivation of everyone before they get here, it certainly, so Philo, made a difference in what they remember when they come back home. This is a phenomenon that the anthropologist Victor Turner, right, wrote about, right, which he called communitas, not community, which is something that endures, but the feeling of community, of equality that doesn't take place at home, but does take place on pilgrimage. Because often they go back home, and then the differences in the rich and the poor, the privileged families and the less privileged, this is what rules daily life, and probably could be, can be seen in places of worship as well. But when they come to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, there's something that happens through this Mass that makes them into one body, and gives them the sense that we all belong to the same congregation, to the same people, and we're all equal and in the eyes of God. And as you look, I'll skip over the next source, but you look here on the short quote from Masechet Zvachim, it says here, one may bring much, the other little. The main thing is that he focus his intentions on heaven. So if somebody brought, at least in principle, had, paid for, 10 cows, 10 steers for whole offerings, and the other one, right, brought a widow's mite for a dove, if we take the New Testament case, then they're equal in the eyes of God. They're fulfilled their commandment of bringing the sacrifices, and that difference in wealth doesn't show. And I found that among the pilgrims, for the most part, at least until they get to the souvenir store, and then one of them buys this huge creche and the other one buys 2 keychains. But otherwise, it's something that one would see, when you go to the masses there, whether it be the Holy Sepulchre or at the Garden Tomb or in other sites that were here. Okay. One of the questions that I asked was, and then I'll move on to modern pilgrimage, is, okay, how did then, after all, for most of the people coming here, they were strangers. If you lived in Jerusalem or in Lydda, maybe you came to the temple a few times a year. Maybe you came more often. Maybe you came for every festival. But certainly, if you lived in Babylon, or if you lived in Rome, or even if you lived in Alexandria, for most people, for many people at least, it was once in a lifetime, right? What's more, for Jews, at least of the Second Temple period, there was something very strange about pilgrimage. For one, you sacrificed animals. An animal sacrifice was not practiced, you can say, okay, yes, maybe in one little place, but in general was not practiced throughout the Jewish diaspora, wherever people lived. And the way they dressed, and the purification regulations, and the role of the priests was not duplicated in each and every community in daily life. People had to learn that when they came to the temple, when they came to Jerusalem. So how is it that they came away, or at least Philo came away, with this sentiment that we're all one and not feel completely estranged by the experience? Okay. And I found that in looking now through this Second Temple material, that there were laws that were actually enacted to increase the sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, and to reduce the inequalities between people. It wasn't simply spontaneous. For example, right, animal sacrifice, okay? Supposing, right, you brought, right, you know, one person, as I said, one gave the widow's mite, and the other, you know, brought, 20 steers to the temple, okay? Now what happens when you've brought the meat and you've sacrificed it on the altar? Well, unlike in pagan temples, you couldn't sell the meat on the market. Remember, Paul talks about it, you know, what do you do? Can you buy slaughtered meat? Okay, pagans. There was no market for sacred meat, okay, in Jerusalem. And any sacrifice that you bring, sort of the most that you could, the longest section of time that you were allowed to consume the meat was, I think, about 36 hours. It may be a bit less. Now, supposing you've come and you've brought a steer or a goat to the altar, and it's now the eve of the Passover, and you're eating that, and now in nightfall you've got to finish because you've got a Passover lamb to eat. How much can you wolf down? So there is a result, when there are poor people that are around and don't have what to eat, there's always an abundance of meat that's there for free, because whatever isn't eaten has to be burnt by the next morning. So this meat is there, and as a result, anyone who is around the temple and who has undergone purity is going to come away with a full stomach, because there's all this more meat than possibly can be consumed, right? Or a second law, the idea of that everyone before going into the temple, this reminds us actually of pilgrimage to Mecca, wears a white garment, leaves their walking stick and their money purse on the outside, leave their shoes on the outside of the Temple Mount, and before at least entering the court of Israel, if they were brought sacrifice, right, and probably had to, for the Temple Mount as well, had to immerse themselves naked in a ritual bath. Well, the difference between Rothschild and the beggar is a little bit less in the ritual bath than it is when they're fully dressed. Right? So all of these are other laws that level out the field, that show, that make the difference between people less, so that all feel part of it. And I want to use this through something that some of you may think is kind of nitpicking, but I like it. Look at this next source. It's the last source that I'll use from this section. Second tithe. Second tithe, Ma'aser Sheni, is a fund that you have 7 years in the sabbatical cycle. 6 years you work the land, and most people, maybe as much as 90% of the time, lived off the land as farmers, fishermen, and so on. There was one tithe that was destined for the priests, and then 2 years in every 7 year cycle there was a second tithe, and 4 years there was a tithe that went to the Levites. Okay. The second tithe could only be used for food, drink, and oil for anointment during the festivals, pilgrimage festivals in Jerusalem. That meant you had this kind of supply, and you wouldn't have to know, well, how am I going to pay for the trip? Because if you had farming, you just got put aside, and you have the second tithe there. Now, second tithe can be, if you have wheat, it can be wheat. You can dry it out, or so. You can have figs, you can bring dried figs. But it's most convenient, especially if people are going a long ways, to sell the tithe and then to preserve the money, put that aside, and those coins, and you say, this is dedicated for second tithe. Okay. Or you can bring the wine or the oil or whatever you have itself. Okay? Watch. Second tithe, here, the money, may not be sold, nor given as pledged, nor exchanged, nor used for reckoning weights. Right? In other words, all kinds of laws that say you can't get any benefit from it. For example, you've got your second tithe money. If he's a money changer, pile it up on the table so people think you're doing, even if you don't use it, you're doing a good business. You're an active, money changer. No, you can't do that. Even that's a benefit you can't use. One may not say to his neighbor in Jerusalem, now we've jumped to the product itself, right, the produce, not the monies. Here is wine and give me oil in exchange. Or here is oil, give me wine in exchange, right? One guy comes from Hebron and he has lots of grapes and he's pressed them into wine, and the other comes from the Galilee and he's got the vats of olive oil, and he said, hey, why don't we, let's exchange. They're all second tithe dedicated to the temple. But one may, but that you can't do. But one may say, here is wine for you, for I have no oil. Or, here is oil for you, for I have no wine. But they give each other free gifts. And now look at the commentary, or the second verse, Tosefta. Consequently, they exchange and yet do not exchange and do each other favors. Right? Now, you'd think, what is this? It's like, reminds me as a child, you can't turn on the light on the Sabbath, but you can fall on the switch or so, so you're not really turning on the lights, But it's there's a logic to it. It says, right, in the end, since he cannot legally enforce the transaction, it's not an exchange. In other words, these are laws. But these laws, right, define a very fine line that say, look, we know you don't want to spend all of that you've saved up, drinking wine. Well, maybe you do, or drinking oil. So we want to allow for exchange, but we don't want this ever to become a contract, a fully legal exchange. So supposing we met in Jerusalem and I brought the oil and you brought the wine, right? And then I said, hey, I've got you, that's nice oil. Why don't you have some wine? Because I don't have any oil. And you say, well, why don't you have some oil? I don't have any wine, right? And then I give you, right, you give me the wine and I say, thank you very much, have a nice holiday, and walk away. You can yell, you can complain, but you have no legal means of getting that oil from me because we haven't done anything that's contractual. And this is exactly that very fine line. Of course, when we give gifts, we expect gifts to be returned. And if we give lots of gifts and the person doesn't return, we can be very angry. We can even curse them out, but we can't sue them and say, give me my, this is, right? And this is what's trying to be done here, to try to create an alternative economy on pilgrimage, where it's not a question of how much you paid and how much do you owe me, but here, take. And as a result, of that opening for gratitude in order to say, thank you, listen, why don't you take some of what I have, right? And that's exactly drawing that fine line, okay? Okay. So these are, what I was saying, these are some of the questions that I brought from pilgrimage and tried to look at Second Temple material and understand what the experience of pilgrimage was. And as I continued, right, to study, I found later that I didn't want to continue working on Second Temple pilgrimage. For one, because, after I'd done that, I wanted to ask the question, what happens when the temple is destroyed in the experience of pilgrims? What do they do instead? And I didn't like the answers I found. Right, Jewish answers, very Jewish writers at the time, spoke about the temple being replaced by the synagogue, and I'm saying, how does that work exactly? I used to bring lambs to be sacrificed, and now I'm going to read a text that says I used to sacrifice lambs. If you're a pilgrim, you know it's not the same thing, right? There was, particularly under influence, I think, of the book of Hebrews, the notion of that the temple was spiritualized. So instead of being, the sacrifice, now instead, excuse me, I'm oversimplifying, we have the sacrifice of Christ who died for our sins, and this replaces the temple, or Jesus is the temple, or the church is the temple. I can see how that works over a period of several centuries, but I don't see how it worked for the pilgrims who actually experienced the temple and who knew on a very visceral level that reading a text about sacrifices in your afternoon or morning prayer, or taking the host and now seeing Jesus' sacrifice may be something, but it wasn't pilgrimage. So what happens in the experience of people after that center was destroyed? And that was the question I asked, and I realized that I couldn't get any good answer from the sources, because the sources are not precise enough to date it to within a generation and to say, that's what happened for people who knew the reality in the year 70 AD and who now were writing this down in the year 100 AD. We just don't have the fine-tuning that allows that to be done. And then I wanted to do something because that had to do more with people's experience than with texts. And at first I went to my own pilgrimage, which was to the place where my father grew up, where my grandmother was buried before my father hid out and before my grandfather was killed in Auschwitz, and to go back to there and then to see what pilgrimage was like there. In what sense was that a pilgrimage? Especially since when I started to look at that in the early 1990s, the pilgrimage of I call it pilgrimage of Israeli youth groups to Poland was still at its beginning, and I would see small groups of people traveling to very, very out-of-the-way places in Eastern Europe, apparently to look for their roots or to mourn over the Holocaust. And I said, maybe I'm looking at the new Tisha B'Av, the new 9th of Av. Maybe this is how mourning rituals start. Maybe that's the way, just as people would after a few generations, not immediately, when the Second Temple was destroyed, say, okay, we need to leave a corner of our house not painted, or sit on the ground and put on sackcloth and ashes on the anniversary of the destruction of the temple. That wasn't what people did 1 year after it was destroyed. They had far other, more pressing things, to deal with. But after a generation or two, when one wants to carry that on, to speak to the children and the grandchildren who never knew the temple and to tell the story, then the place becomes important. Then the rite becomes important. Parentheses, just as none of the disciples went walking behind Jesus with a piece of chalk marking X's on the ground saying Jesus was here, let's build our church here, because as long as the master, the rabbi, is alive, who needs the place where he walked? There he is. But 2 generations later, that becomes important because one can only tell the story and one needs places and rites to mark out the story. So I thought, maybe that's what's happening in the 1990s, when I was looking at it, among these school kids who are going to Poland in order to mourn, and maybe this is the way that the extermination of European Jewry will be remembered for the next 2,000 years. That was the beginning, and I worked on that, and I found actually that's the wrong question, because these things have much more to do with Israeli nationalism than they have to do with traditional Jewish mourning rites. Okay, but the questions of pilgrimage, and the questions of what one does through pilgrimage and what one tries to remember through pilgrimage, these accompanied me throughout, still do, in terms of what I was studying and what I was looking for. And later on, so now over the last, now a bit less now, but over the last decade or so, or 5 or 7 years, I've been trying to, both through my own experience and through that of guides who we interviewed, mostly Jewish Israeli guides. There's a lapse here, I'm aware of it, to see, well, what happens in this intersection of Jewish guide, Christian pilgrim, and Holy Land? Because here we have pilgrims, that come from many places in the world, that are brought together by their Christian faith or by their search for some Christian experience that brings them here, to travel, to the Holy Land, Bible land, Israel, Palestine, whatever they choose, however they choose to call it. And when they come here, some with full awareness, some unexpectedly, they find themselves being led around the country by a Jew, very often by a Jewish Israeli guide. Not all, and we can talk about what it's like to be led by a Christian religious, what it's like to be led by an Arab Palestinian Christian or Muslim guide, but this is something I had much more knowledge about, even though it's only part of the picture. And so how are these things negotiated? Now, guides, of course, are not simply, right, altruistic educators. They're out to make a living, right? So what is told and how they're told are very often not necessarily a reflection of a guide's, at least, inner faith and conviction. There may also be a desire to please the public, because that's what you need to get tips, to get to be requested again for another group, and so on. I wondered, okay, one side is for the different Christian groups and how they react to this confrontation or meeting with a Jewish guide, to which there's no single answer, right? Just to give an example, two of the most frequent questions that I would be asked as a Jewish guide for a Christian group was from the side of Catholics, oh, are you a practicing Jew? What synagogue do you go to? And from evangelical groups, it would be, you know the Bible, our Bible so well. When did you discover Jesus? Okay. Now, these have to do with, in part, what the boundaries are and what I would say authenticates Christian practice. For many evangelicals, if you talk the talk, you walk the walk. So if you are listening, and listening empathetically, right, to evangelical Bible reading or preaching, or even using the same tropes and tones of voice to describe them, because if I would read a section of the Hebrew Bible, so occasionally I would read the verses or quote them by heart, and then I wouldn't, as some guides do, saying, all right, this is a New Testament verse, here, Father Williams, would you like to read? But rather, so I've read from Deuteronomy. We've come to Cana. All right, perhaps I'll read the opening, or I read the beginning of the Gospel of John. It was on the third day, and Jesus came to Cana in Galilee, and so on. And if the tone is the same, as one's reading the same, especially if one's reading from the same book, which I learned quickly not to do. I learned to travel with two Bibles. So at least people see, okay, I'm switching off, I'm doing something. Oh, wait a minute, right? Then it's assumed, okay, if you're reading it as we do, right, then you must be one of us. So when did you discover Jesus, right? Whereas there is nothing, I think, that I can do short of a long seminary education and ordination that would make me able, or want to, in front of a Christian group, right, to say, this is my body, right? Can't do that, right? Wouldn't do that either. But this ordination, being man of the cloth, already sets up a barrier, and then the question is, so what synagogue do you belong to if you know the Bible? Okay. So different groups will react in different ways, and that's, excluding, without going into, okay, what does it mean to be Jewish and Israeli, and how does the Israeli-Palestinian conflict interplay, which I can talk about a good deal. But my question was perhaps very selfishly, what does it do for the guides? Okay? Because pilgrims are coming, many of them, in order to seek, at least many claim, a life-changing experience. And for some it really is, right? Whereas guides, one would think, right, are there in order to make a living, right? And, but what I found was that guides very often, particularly if I talk about Jewish Israeli guides, first of all, many of them are immigrants. here. Not so surprising, right? English, okay, but if your guide speaks, let's say, Brazilian Portuguese, then it's likely it's because he grew up in Brazil, not because, he went to the guide course and chose, I'm going to study Portuguese. Well, it could happen, but so you have many people who guide us, particularly in languages that were their native languages before they immigrated. Okay, that's one part of the story. Also, they may want to be away from home more than other jobs will give them the chance to be. They may want to be away from the daily life of Israel, even though they're immigrants and Israelis for a good deal of the time, right? And they may enjoy, and most do enjoy, being on stage and playing a kind of role that one does with the guides. But the problem with role playing, especially in a place I think that's as charged with history, with spirituality as the Holy Land, right? That I think it has an action that makes if you like, the electrons jump out of their orbit, right? They become charged in ways that allow them to, that at some point cause them to lose control over the narrative completely. Let me give an example. At one point I was guiding sort of some month, about 31 days in the month, or 32, that can happen. Right? It can happen. You have two groups, and one goes to the airport and pick up another, And I'd come home, and my daughter, was very small at the time, said, "No, Abba, saper li sipur," tell me a story, because I had told her biblical stories all the time, each night before she went to bed. And, I'd started in Genesis, and by now I was, somewhere, we'd gotten to the end of Kings, I was somewhere in Isaiah, and I was just tired, and I, "No, Abba, tell me a story," so, well, it was at Capernaum, so I started, it was at Capernaum, right, and I start quote from the Gospel of Mark, and it was on the Saturday, and Jesus came into the synagogue, and there was a man there with an unclean spirit, and I stopped after about a minute, and I said, "That's enough, right, go to sleep, I'll tell you some more tomorrow." Why? Because there was a sense that I had that I didn't want this to be one of Daddy's stories. I wanted the Hebrew Bible to be part of the stories that she has inherited from her father. And, let her open the New Testament and read this when she's older, but let this not be charged with the same kind of family tradition of, this is the story that I heard from my father. But because I had been reading for 32 days that month, right, the passages from the Hebrew Bible and from the New Testament, and often with the same feeling tones, and then some of these things creep into the offstage, if you like, performance. In other ways, too, I asked one of the guys in an interview, "Tell me, is it important for you to know that the group knows that you're Jewish?" By the way, some people, it's not always the case, right? And he says, "Yes, of course." And I asked him why. He said, "Well, they believe in Jesus, I believe in Moses." I said, "You believe in Moses? What is that? What does it mean for a Jew to believe in Moses?" But it's a kind of a trope, it's a way of speaking, and I think these things, in some way, right, get under the skin. And they can get under the skin in ways that blur somehow the differences, because I think, not all, but even if it's their job, right, if people are coming and they're undergoing a spiritual experience, one that will change them, and undergoing it not somewhere out there, let's say not for a Jew, say in Rome, okay, right, or in Compostela, right, but here in Jerusalem, these same sites for many Jews, Jewish Israeli guides, are charged with historical and spiritual meaning. So when one speaks enthusiastically, right, about the Sea of Galilee, it isn't, okay, this is what I need to pour on for the sake of the pilgrims who are here to see Jesus. It's because these things have meaning in a Zionist text. As a pioneer land, these things have meanings, right? Other meanings for Jews. So that one is, if you like, one is open to the charge that these places have, and one should be, but very often are, sensitive to the spiritual meaning that these have for the people who, one relates to. It's not one comes on stage for an hour and you do your spiel and then you go home. If you're there with a group for 8 or 10 days, right, then you have to be pretty obtuse or dislike your group intensely in order not to be influenced by the things that matter to them. And if they matter to them, and if they are spiritually charged, then it's hard to sort of shut off that stream when you kind of take off your license and and you go home and you're a husband or a father or whatever. These things continue to influence. They could be, though, also, this is not to say that differences don't count. I'll give you one or two, I see I'm running out of time, but one or two quotes. Look over here, say at this one from an Italian Jewish guide who I call Roberto, sort of at the beginning of page 2, okay? Roberto. So from the outset, I felt that, this is an interview, yeah? I felt that my home was more in Jerusalem than in Italy. It's such a unique place, an enchanting place. The people interested me, and Judaism interests me intellectually. For me, Judaism is morality and the direct connection to God. I don't need anyone to be my mediator. I don't need the shepherd with his staff. Okay, so the separation, as understood, between Judaism and Christianity, it's his way of expressing it. My father was a Christian and my mother was Jewish, so I lived in the Christian world my entire life. Whoever grew up as I did in an Italian village with few Jews and went to Mass to pray, whoever grew up that way has a special understanding of things. He knows what the Christian has in his head. Until 30 years ago, the Vatican prohibited the study of Judaism and the Hebrew Bible. The Italian Christians date back 2,000 years and don't know who Jesus was, what a Jew is. The common people don't link up to the intellectual theories, so when they arrive here in Israel, we construct their knowledge in their language and in their mentality, and that's a great accomplishment. I prepare them a picnic on the Mount of Beatitudes where you see the entire lake. People get high from that. I prepare them sandwiches and fruit. I read to them from the Hebrew Bible after I've led them to understand the story from the territory. And then when I read to them from the Hebrew Bible, they react with, wow. There's an element of mission in guiding in Israel. It's not a vacation, but an experience. I also believe that contributing to knowledge is contributing towards peace. I chose Judaism, and it's the best thing I've done in my life, and I have no regrets, not the shadow of a doubt. I chose, and I'm at peace so I can live with others, and have no reason to fear. Many Italian guides don't go into churches, and in their position they transmit that they don't want to get dirty. I go inside and provide the complementary Jewish part to the priest's words, all if the priest agrees, of course. Every Christian is also a Jew, he just doesn't know it, but when he gets here, he discovers that. Okay? Okay. So, again, this is just quotes from the interview. And yes, there is this kind of, as he sees it, this Jewish-Christian competition. And he sees his job as to be an educator, but also these are affirmations of self, because there's a decision that he made in order to follow, if you like, the religion of his mother or the religion of his father, and to decide to leave Italy and come here. And later in the interview, you see, it isn't all that simple. There are times where he wonders, gee, did I, is this the right decision? But then guiding becomes a reaffirmation of that. And I'll give one more example. There are many here later that I think is particularly poignant. Okay, I call her Francine. Okay, look at this. Number 3, it's on the next page, page 3. She is an Orthodox Jewish woman who lives in the Jewish quarter and who works primarily guiding Francophone Christian pilgrims, right, in Jerusalem and sometimes elsewhere in the Holy Land. Okay, so I am Jewish, born and raised, but I had an interruption when I was hidden, right, during World War II. I learned Christianity. We were in hiding with my parents, living in a small village as a Christian family. I went to school and learned religion. It was very interesting. My grandmother made sure I would learn well, but every Sunday before Mass would whisper in my ear in Yiddish, "Vergess nicht, dass du bist a Yidne." Don't forget you're a Jewess. In the beginning, three dots, Christianity, I'm quoting here, was in competition with Judaism. The borders between Christianity and Judaism were unclear. So there was a need to separate, to show that the Jews don't have the truth. It's written black on white that the Jews must be preserved, but only in a state of humiliation that attests to Christian truth that Judaism is passé. Like the Germans who prohibited Jews from going to the bathhouse and then said that the Jews are dirty and smelly. I tried to make them understand that instead of humiliating the Jews and saying that they were punished, they can observe their religion in peace. But I also tried to transmit that Christianity is one of the three monotheistic religions, although it's not so monotheistic. I tell them that the worship of Isis persisted very late in the Roman Empire, and the only way to deal with it was to dress Isis up in a blue robe and call her Mary, Mother of Jesus. They sincerely believe that they worship one God. When the Creator created man, he placed in him a spark of divinity. That's how we come to a recognition of the Creator. If we're lucky and are born to the Jewish people, we're closer to the source. I want to transmit the Jewish message that people will understand what Judaism really is. I want to show them that the Jewish sources of their faith, to show them the history of their religion in its natural setting, to show how Christianity is separated from Judaism and why. After a day of churches, it's a pleasure to take a shower. I have the feeling that some kind of impurity weighs upon me. In addition, there's the thing that almost all the churches I know of are built on sites of idolatry, and in fact, they continue to worship idols. Now, I don't know how you felt listening to this text, but I would imagine, if I can be presumptuous, that there were portions in this text where you kind of cringe and go back, and there are portions where you can say, hey, that's where you can say that there's a kind of a spiritual commonality. But rather than dissect it, what I find interesting is, here is someone, and she said at another point, she said, look, on the one hand, she said, they worship idols. But on the other hand, it's thanks to that worship that I and my family are alive today. Because it's their faith in Mary, right? It was their faith that made them risk their lives in order to save and to hide a Jewish family during the Shoah, during the Holocaust. So what does this Orthodox Jewish woman do? She comes home, if I can summarize, and takes a shower because she's been in churches the whole day, and then goes out the next morning or the next day to guide another Christian group in another series of churches. And one wonders, or I don't wonder, I would say, that this ambiguity of, yeah, it's idol worship, but I like the aesthetics and it was all very pretty, and what's more, it's thanks to this worship that I and my family are alive today. She relives out every time she goes and guides another group to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, another Christian group in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So, whatever one says about, her understandings of Judaism and Christianity, it means that much of what is going on the stage of guiding is very much a reflection not of, okay, what do they want to hear so that I'll get a good tip, but of very deep, historical, personal, and spiritual processes, ambiguities, right, that she undergoes, and she undergoes again, right, every time she comes back and takes another Christian group. Okay, so I would say this: these interactions of guide, pilgrim group, and land are very various. Not by any means do I mean to say either my experience or that of the two people I quoted here, so-called Roberto and Francine, are reflective of every pilgrimage, guided pilgrimage tour, every group. Change the group, change the identity of the guide, change even the length of the experience, and you'll have different things that come out. But for me at least, right, I said that How Christian Pilgrims Made Me Israeli, right, which is the subtitle of my book, is the idea that there isn't this separation simply between being out there and guiding Christians, for a living and going back and being, an Israeli, at home. And the way Christians think about, pilgrims think about the land, relate to the land, sometimes resonates with my own experience growing up elsewhere in a Orthodox Jewish home and coming here. In some ways conflicts with it, but always it's there, and I think it's a very enriching part of identity. And if it's not in conflict, this kind of friction of the, not only harmony, but friction of the religions, right, against each other can be extremely, I think, productive in our, discovering, okay, what really matters to us. Thank you.
Where's the microphone? Just stand for some minutes by the questions. If somebody want to make some question.
I just want to, when you said about the pilgrimage to Poland, so, and I'm not sure if I understood well, but you said that nowadays, even if you can compare with the possible future Tisha B'Av, but it's still a nationalist initiative, and maybe I wonder if the Jewish feasts that we have today, maybe they started also as a nationalist initiative.
I think that's interesting. For one, I mean, in its pre-modern sense, okay, because, Judea, right, Samaria, Moab, Egypt, in many ways were not nation states as we see them today, okay? And the way that often that religion and boundaries interplayed are not necessarily the same, right? Although they're not the same across the world today. But if you look at, say, in some ways you're certainly right. If you look at when the kingdom, I think one of the clear evidences clearest cases is when the Bible describes the kingdom splitting in two, right? The people come to Rehoboam, Solomon's son, and so he comes to them, and they say, okay, lighten our load, less taxes, less forced labor. He says to them, I think about it, and then he insults them. My pinky is thick, my little one is thicker than my father's loins. The people and the kingdoms break apart. Okay, the 2 tribes remain loyal to the house of David, and the 10 tribes form a confederation of the northern tribes. The first thing that's mentioned that the king of the 10 tribes, Jeroboam, does is he puts up 2 golden calves, one at Dan and one at Bethel, and he says, because if people go to Jerusalem on pilgrimage, they'll recognize the David as their king. So what he's concerned with is that obviously religious symbols were used in the ancient world and often in the modern world as ways of gaining political legitimacy. The king who rules in the city of the temple is the legitimate king, right? So in this sense, yes, the pilgrimage festivals, in Jerusalem were political. But I would say that if you look at both the agricultural basic level of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, okay? The spring festival of the Passover, the harvest festival, the first barley of the Feast of Weeks, the festival of booths, gathering in of fruit, right? These are festivals on this level. These are festivals that are not made in order to mark out national boundaries, right? They get a historical level on top of it, right? Passover becomes the Exodus, right? The Sukkot becomes God's protecting them in the desert. Shavuot, it takes hundreds and hundreds of years before that becomes the festival of the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. But I think they don't start out as national festivals in the sense of, you know, this is our festival, this is our border, this is our territory, this is what distinguishes us and makes us better, more powerful than those guys down the road or just across the border. So in that sense, I would say it's much less national, right, than the trips to Poland, or then through civil religious festivals all over the world, holidays of independence or memorial days, right? National festivals, I would say, always mark out stronger borders than religious ones. Two religions can share a territory. Two nations can't. So in that sense, I think they're different. Yeah.
Okay, another question. I think it was very interesting to see also the history of Tuvia. The number 6 is very interesting. Somebody wants to comment on that? Yes.
So my question is actually a little bit what Joel asked. And so do you consider those trips to, I'm Polish, to Poland, to the camps as a pilgrimage, and what would be the difference between the Shalosh Regalim and so the concept of religious pilgrimage and the trips to the Shoah places?
Well, I think there are a lot. One would be that, you know, when the pilgrimage to the temple, right, for the Shalosh Regalim was always right. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord. It's the high place, right? It's a place where one ascends to, right? Spiritually, not only physically, right? We all know Mount Moriah, or the Temple Mount is not higher than the Mount of Olives, but spiritually and going up. In Poland, the most important places are the lowest places. Are Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Majdanek. These are the highlights or the lowlights, right, of the tour. Okay. And whereas I would say in pilgrimage, one is affirming one's connection to the holy place, right, as the place that gives meaning to all the periphery, right? We may live in Alexandria, in that other one I skipped over, but our metropolis, our mother, is here in Jerusalem, right? On the Israeli trips to Poland, one goes there in order to depict Poland as a death world, as a hostile place, in order to reaffirm Israel is the place of life, right? And I think that the manifestation of national identity towards others, right, is much stronger than on the traditional pilgrimages. It's not that there aren't things like that here. If I look at the march of some of you may be familiar, surrounding the old city with the flags that are done mainly right by national religious groups. This to me looks very, very much, even though it's not a death place, but reminds me very, very much of the trips to Poland, in that the idea is not only to be there and to see, but to show and to manifest presence to others. One, to show that Israel is the home and not there, because the diaspora is dead. Right? And the other, I would say, because because of the way it's orchestrated, because of the way that the state has built this in order to say, now you should know why you need to defend the state. Right? Because this is the alternative, right? Poland, as death world. Okay? So in a sense, here, Poland becomes not the value in and of itself, but a kind of a screen on which a certain kind of national identity is projected. Now, I've simplified some, and yes, there are other people even among these groups who go to Poland for other reasons, because my grandmother was there and so on. But the overall text of the trip, I would say that is the case. And we don't, in the sources on the Second Temple pilgrimage, right, I don't find anywhere that one needs to show others on the outside that, you know, hey, we are here. It doesn't become, in that sense, a claim to territory and to nation, to belong.
You mentioned the pilgrimage in the Second Temple period, and afterwards the Christian pilgrimage somehow during the history, especially nowadays. My question is, how do you see, or how do you consider the pilgrimage of the Jews or Judaism during the feasts, for example, to Jerusalem or to Israel? Do you consider such as pilgrimage? I ask because we have many visitors coming as tourism, or well, I don't know how to say that, but we have even some help from some Christian communities, some evangelicals. I recall, for example, if I'm not mistaken, during Sukkot, there is a parade or a march that we have some people coming from evangelical groups coming to join this feast and so forth.
Right.
So how do you consider that? Is it a pilgrimage, or how do you say about that?
I think it's, yeah. I mean, certainly the Jews coming from the diaspora to Israel for holidays or otherwise has certain elements of pilgrimage. Although, you know, are they religious or not, one would have to kind of dissect and say what does exactly it mean to them, because there are those that are not particularly, don't consider themselves as particularly observant or religious, but for whom Israel has a special role. And it has to do with, you know, what role Israel can play as part of diaspora Jewish identity, even aside from a, let's say, from God's presence, or from a worshiping God through the pilgrimage. Now, what you mentioned with the evangelical groups is the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Tabernacles, on the one hand, it develops and interprets, right, a biblical theme. In particular, in Isaiah, and come the end of days, where all those who don't go up to Jerusalem on the Feast of Tabernacles, right, the rain will not fall upon them, and it will come, right, and on that day, right, all will come up to prophecy of Isaiah, so that all will come up to Jerusalem, and among many, perhaps most of the evangelicals who participate, the sense that we are living in the end time, and that we're on a stage in which the biblical prophecies of the end time, Old Testament prophecies of the end time, will be fulfilled, and the New Testament prophecies of Revelations, and it's part of a stage that will lead to the building of the temple, the rapture, the roar of Gog and Magog, the second coming of Jesus, and so on. So these are all their interpretation, not across the board, but certainly those who come on the Feast of Tabernacles, their understanding of the events also in contemporary Israeli history are as signs leading to the end time, right? Are as signs of the approaching end, and therefore, you know, one needs to participate in order to be among those who will be raptured or will be saved. And if I'm simplifying, you know, excuse me. There's another thing that's a phenomenon of the last 20, 25 years, and that is a wholesale adoption in many evangelical circles of Jewish ritual as a means of authentication. One of the biggest is the Temple of Solomon, right, in Brazil, right? But there are others, right? And you have many cases, people who, you know, who have never seen or hardly ever seen a Jew in their lives, and live on a mountain in Kentucky in the South, who will then bring in a Messianic Jewish rabbi and cause a Passover Seder and wear Jewish prayer shawls, and even, you know, and it's come into other circles. People ask me, how many times have I heard people talking about, and this is where 12-year-old Jesus in the temple mentioned in the Gospels, this is where Jesus had his bar mitzvah. And often I don't have the heart to tell them, do you know when a bar mitzvah started? Right? Do I really want to tell them the first bar mitzvah was instituted in medieval Germany as an imitation of the Catholic communion? But you have this adoption of these Jewish customs and ritual in a church that proclaimed that we don't have ritual, right? Not ritual. We have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, so we don't need the ritual. But here, the last especially 20-25 years, all this ritual has come in as ways of saying, you see, we're doing it the right way. We're doing it an authentic way. We're doing the way, Jesus did, So I think and of course the way that these things are performed are different. What should I tell them? There was no Seder in Jesus' day. It was instituted, after the destruction. People had a sacrifice. They had Passover lamb, but they didn't have a Seder. They didn't have a bar mitzvah. But these things are ways of saying, this is old. This is where they're doing it the right way. So we need to adopt those rituals as part of our service. And the Feast of Tabernacles has some of that along with this kind of end time anticipation.
Okay. I think that you can see that we talk about 2,000 years or more for the big, rich, profound history. You cannot explore everything in one night, but you can just start for. So thank you very much, Jackie, for this your presence. Thank you for everyone.
Thank you.
And I think that our side is very important to take care. The Christian guide, not to everybody, but we need to improve more our way to guide the Christian people here. So sometimes we bring with us now our imaginary and put here in the head is very, very complicated one. And some groups really, they are very pleased to receive the Jewish people, our objectivity to guide in the right place. So it is very important mixed realities that we have here, and we need to go and to discuss it. I think it will reach each side with this one.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rick.
And I apologize in some way just because of time, and maybe it's not there of speaking for an hour and a quarter and not referring in any of this in any way to the way that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict plays out in the guiding. And I think it's another time because I can't do justice to it in a few minutes.
It will be the next time for this one, okay? So thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you, Ilya.